Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Banff 2022. In many ways, this is the most significant meeting we've ever had. It was the hardest to produce with the most challenges. Like that. And yeah, I'm very pleased to be here face to face with you. And we have worked very hard on all the various bells and whistles. I should tell you about some of them. So we have for you today, for those who want it, the Banff Handbook from 1996. This was the basis for the negotiation in 1997 with CCTT, and I've put a forward on the first page to sort of bring it from 1996 to 2022. The name of the session comes from this paper, so whatever you can do in green you can in it. That's from our editorial in KI from 2021. Some of you were eager to see my new Tesla, and I do have it, but I didn't bring it. And the reason I didn't bring it is that I wanted to be able to accommodate this painting, which I understood was bigger than it is, but it is wraparound. It's sort of interesting art, eh? So, and if you think of the situation we're in with pig-to-human transplants, we don't know that this will work at all, but if it does, it's going to change everything, right? So those 5 pigs in that picture, and those of you in this room can do a lot to move us toward some final determination of what will be the future of pig-to-human transplants. And finally, you may wonder whether we ever knew what we were doing. You know, we're generating consensus. Did we look at anybody else writing about generating consensus? The answer to that, I think, is quite amusing. There's this book, which is now in its 4th edition, by Sam Kainer. And the first edition was 1996. There's one in 2022, and he's working on a new one for the 2030s. Yeah. But we have always been consistently ahead of that book. And the first edition used terminology that none of you would like, including troublemakers in the solution. Isn't that awful? We've never had troublemakers in Banff. Never, ever. We've had spirited discussants, you know, but never troublemakers. Yeah. So you may wonder about the 2 video cameras. What's the deal with that? Yeah? Why do we need 2? They are remarkably different, and it's sort of a metaphor for modern life. The taller video camera runs for 12 hours. It captures the entire frame where any action could be taking place. It doesn't zoom, it doesn't turn, it doesn't do anything. And if everybody leaves the room, it still records. It records everything for 12 hours without any zooming or focusing or anything. And the other video camera is run by NISPA and ARIA, 2 students who lead our videography team. And it is zooming and panning and doing everything to enhance the capture of the action. And that includes Sony smile shutter capture of still images from the video stream. So you'll get lots of still images from today, hundreds, but you won't see anybody taking pictures. It's all coming from that video stream and the zoomed in images. But wouldn't you wonder about, is this presentation really worth listening to? How would you determine that? Well, first of all, Do the processes and technology described really work? And secondly, is there a comedy meme, a new kind of joke, based on this, and has it been successful? And the answer to both of those is a resounding yes. So anyway, so the video team I just told you about there in the back, they independently went to the University of Alberta library and rented that video gear that ordinarily you can only rent for 48 hours. The moment they told the staff it was for this meeting, they let them have it for an entire week. Yeah. Now you may think they did that because they knew the theme of my presentation this morning was bold moves by women. But they didn't know that. They did that because they'd taken my course, and the course has a theme of, there is no limit to how big you can think. And that's the reason that they independently went out and got their own gear. What would have happened if they hadn't done that? Well, I ordered gear for this meeting, and there were certain supply chain disruptions. So part of the gear I ordered for the meeting is coming on September 30th, and the other is coming on November 30th. So unless they had done that, we wouldn't have had any spontaneous video at all. And what about the humor? Well, Brad Ferris is right here. You notice the exact center of the room is where Brad Ferris is. And so he runs the Banff Digital Pathology Working Group. And it's a very dynamic group that has meetings every 2 weeks. And what we have discovered in terms of this new meme for humor is the idea, just think about this phrase, Banff Working Group. Isn't it much better, Banff Hard Working Group? Or what about, maybe there could be also Banff Heartedly Working Group, right? So those are two concepts you maybe didn't have before this morning that you now have that are part of the new humor that is coming out of the Banff Digital Pathology Working Group. Okay, back to the presentation. Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Report from the early days of Banff. I have no disclosures. That quote is a part of a longer quote that then continues, boldness has genius, power, and magic to it. Many of the most important bold moves in Banff were moves by women. There should be an effort to honor the women of Banff. And probably the leadership of Banff will be female, predominantly female in the long run. Alex Lupi was the first to suggest that, but it's an idea that I strongly support and predict. I think that's what will happen. For those of us there at the beginning in the early 1990s, the most important bold move of that era had to do with the Banff 97 paper, which for all of us is at the top of our Google Scholar profile. Now, how was Banff 97 negotiated? It was negotiated by Bob Colvin and me, but there were three of us at the front of the room. It was Lorraine, Bob, and me. And although Bob and I did most of the talking, you might think maybe she did most of the thinking, because we went home with the plan that this guy, Kim Solez, was going to write the paper, but everybody waited, the paper didn't get written. So on a certain day, without telling anyone, Lorraine started writing the paper, completed the paper, sent copies to everybody with her as first author. I just thought, wow, it's such a wonderful thing. And that paper is so much better than all the others. Why do I say that? Well, look at the stats yourself. This is my Google Scholar profile. It would be the same for Bob Colvin, for all the others of us active in that generation. That Banff 97 paper is substantially more highly cited than the other Banff papers, and the other Banff papers are also at the top of the list because they're much more heavily cited than the other papers that we have. And that's true for all of us. And so a special thanks to Lorraine for really everything over the past 31 years, but especially the bold move of writing that pivotal Banff 97 paper. All subsequent Banff papers have been based on that paper. We've benefited enormously from the high quality of that paper and Lorraine's continued devotion to the Banff process throughout the decades. And a special thanks to Bob Colvin. I cannot imagine a better person to negotiate with than Bob. A true gentleman. He was an English major in college, but he missed Leonard Cohen. So when he and I encountered each other, who is this Leonard Cohen, you know? And so he had that one defect. As far as I'm concerned, that's his only defect. He has this Leonard Cohen defect, that's it. Otherwise, he was a great guy, and he brought a lot of his English major background, I think, the full panoply of that, to the negotiations that we then engaged in. It was truly fun, it was productive, and you can imagine what the paper might have been like if Bob wrote it or if I wrote it, but I can only say that it's probably better the way Lorraine wrote it. So that is really, really cool. So, boy, I got a big surprise on December 6, 2021. Phil Halloran contacted me out of the blue. I hadn't heard from him for a very long time. And he said, who identified tubulitis as a marker of TCMR? I learned about that from you. It is a fundamental discovery. It outperforms many of the gene transcript sets as a predictor. Well, I found that quite stimulating. So I'm at my computer, and above me are all the editions of Heptonstall's textbook, you know? So that's so astonishing. In those years, 1966 to 1992, there's nothing about tubulitis in the textbook. When it talks about rejection, it talks about looking in the urine to see lymphocytes, and when the rejection is more severe, you get bigger lymphocytes. But that was it. And so it was a very exciting question. What's the real history here? These depictions are by University of Montreal pathology resident Cheng-Yin Wang. And so Vic Pollock, in 1975, a very influential renal physician who, as you know, was part of the beginning of percutaneous kidney biopsies. There were four or five authors on those papers starting in the 1950s. He was one of them. And so he talked about tubulitis in native kidney interstitial nephritis. And he did not really distinguish between the lymphocytes outside the tubules and those inside. He said that the tubules were invaded. But to him, tubulitis was both the peritubular inflammation and also the inflammatory cells in the tubules. Now, Dick Sibley says that when he was in training, Vic Pollock talked about tubulitis in the transplanted kidney a lot. So it's not correct to say that Dick Sibley, because he was the first person to use that term in a paper about the transplanted kidney, that it was original with him. He said it came from Pollock. But anyway, he was so excited about it that he got the description badly wrong. He describes lymphocytes in tubular cytoplasm. He doesn't describe them anywhere else, which is kind of interesting. And that may occasionally occur, but it certainly is not very common. And so that was in 1983, that incorrect description of tubulitis in the transplanted kidney. Regina Barani had a somewhat vague description in 1984, and then we came along in 1985 and described it as it is currently understood. As you see in quotes here, mononuclear cells lying between tubular epithelial cells or beneath them, just inside the tubular basement membrane. And this then became a crucial backdrop against which the Banff classification was created 6 years later. Now, Tom Andreoli also should get some credit for whatever popularity the idea of tubulitis enjoyed, because when he reviewed the first Banff paper, he very much felt that we must put everything about tubulitis on the first page. He said, at least in Kidney International, we know a lot of people don't ever get beyond the first page. They may only read a part of the first page, but they never get to the second page. So you have to put everything about it on the first page. So that's what we did. And this is what that paragraph looks like. You can see it begins and ends with tubulitis. And we had described the non-specificity of interstitial infiltrates in 1984 and the specificity of tubulitis for ejection in 1985. Today and into the future, tubulitis remains just as important as ever. It figured prominently in the 3 articles in the March 2022 issue of AJT with cover graphic acute isn't this fun? Wow. Acute T-cell mediated rejection still a worthy opponent. And for decades, tubulitis has been the focus of morphometry programs long before the era of machine learning. And so now the best machine detection systems use both. They use that long history before machine learning combined with machine learning. So a combination, handcrafted features, texture analysis, and machine learning. Now, if you want to see good examples of that, once again, a plug for not hardly working, but hard-working Banff Digital Pathology Working Group. Yeah, and the videos with Ulysses Bayliss in them. They're really exciting. If you've never been excited about tubulitis before, that'll do it for you. The success of the Banff classification resulted in adoption of biopsy-proven rejection as the endpoint in clinical trials and of identifying a central pathologist for those trials. So 30 years ago in 1992, clinical trials began with mycophenolic acid with me as a central pathologist, and for the next 3 decades, I saw 3 to 7 times more biopsies from clinical trials than I did from local patients, with many different clinical trials of different compounds. There were informal educational uses of digital images for our fellows, for fellow training, both in 2010 and in 2019 when the fellow and I were in the same room. So we could argue we couldn't possibly lose anything, there's no risk to the study of sharing it with the fellow. But it's only this year, 2022, that the company has actually allowed us to put that language into the contract. So this is the first time in 30 years that we've been able to teach based on this very voluminous clinical trials material, something we were never able to do before. We can't identify the trial. All we can say is a clinical trial. Yeah. So the rebel spirit was evident early on. When I presented the Banff classification for the very first time at USCAP, 2 young women heckled me. The other thing to know is that my father was in the audience, right behind him, because I asked him to come. I never asked him to come to any other meeting. I just thought this was kind of significant in my career, and he might find it interesting. And he really did. He was a cardiology person, chief of staff at various VA hospitals and so on, and he'd been to a lot of cardiology meetings, and he assured me there was nothing like that heckling, nothing as interesting in that in ever any cardiology meeting. So he just thought it was very, very interesting. And that, of course, is a dolly image of that. There weren't actual pictures, but yeah, you can identify Agnes. I'm sure you all see Agnes' photo there. So you might have expected then there was a huge falling out after that, and but exactly the opposite happened. Agnes became one of my closest friends. Many pictures of my wife and me doing things with her over the years. Here are such pictures in 1998, and in 1999 with Larry Hunsaker, and again in 1999 with Larry Hunsaker. And here she is. And this is a memorable picture as we get to the end of my presentation. I'm going to revisit this picture. Here she is hiking, and there is at the base of Mount Edith Cavell, the Cavell Pond. It used to have a beautiful trail going down to it. And Agnes went down and waded in that trail. So you swim, yes. you would remember it better, yes. Yeah, what I do remember is she said, I'm just going back to the car for my bathing suit. So, yes, that's the quote that I remember. So, and Bob Colvin, when we got to 2001, he was very much a part of our social group, and here you see the four of us. So Agnes was most often the person who got discussions unstuck. We would be like working out something, and the whole room was just like frozen. They didn't know what to do next, and Agnes would say something and move us forward. Larry Hunsaker was also capable of doing that, and so was Bob Colvin. But that alone doesn't explain my warm embrace of the rebel voice. Where did that come from? And to fully understand that, you need to know about Gary Green of the National Kidney Foundation and Michelle Hales. So there's a video some of you will have watched from September 9th that talks about our gratitude to the National Kidney Foundation. They were providing us with funding of about $400,000 a year for a 10-year period from 1997 to 2007, and that's mainly what the Banff meetings ran on, and we ran on their rules, therefore. They had rules for lots of feedback. And this might amuse you. Those feedback forms had a lot of blank space, sort of encouraging people to write poetry or whatever. And a lot of the feedback we got was worthless because it said so-and-so should not be invited back. I thought, what is this? First of all, a lot of people come because they want to be there, not because they've been asked to come. And in fact, most of the people are in that category. And I just felt that this was philosophically absolutely the opposite of what we were doing with Banff. So the purpose of that feedback was not to identify people who should not be invited back. And the idea that you had to be a transplant pathologist in order to be in the audience was absolutely shown to be not the case by many prominent people who were certainly not transplant pathologists who helped us quite a lot. Now, if you think back to Alex Lupi's paper about the 30 years of Banff, you remember that graphic with those 250 dots and names by the dots? So did you ever wonder why you need 250? Why couldn't we do like the top two, a graphic of Michael and me, right? Wouldn't that be great? Or maybe the top 20 with like Bob Colvin and Roz Mannon and, the people who publish really a lot of, or maybe even the top 200. Why did we have to go to 250? That's because in the interval between 200 and 250, that's where most of the prominent people reside. And like Larry Hunsaker is certainly in there. He didn't have very many papers that have the words Banff transplant in them, but he played a very important role in our meetings. So that graphic would have been seriously flawed with fewer people. Really flawed with 2 people, seriously flawed with 20 or 200. And it's really good with 250. That is the right number. Okay, so back to the National Kidney Foundation. You may remember from the other video, for those who have watched it, that there's John Davis, the CEO, and me. We work quite closely together. Gary Green was the person who was responsible for me as the intermediary between the two of us. We were a part of the National Kidney Foundation. I ran something called NKF Cybernephrology, and so we had a page, like every other part of the NKF had a page, and it didn't get very many people. It wasn't very popular, but we never really thought much about that. But now, my right-hand person at that time was Michelle Hales, and the university got wind of what we were doing with this entity of cyber nephrology, and they offered us their mentoring program for entrepreneurial people. And who would you mentor? Did you mentor the old guy there? No, you mentor the young person. So Michelle got the mentoring. And it was really high quality. She had her own mentor, but a bunch of other people also teaching her and thinking about where NKF cyber fit in the whole universe, of everything related to it. And they had a very clear message for her, which she took to home, which was that we needed our own website. Well, that's kind of shocking. None of the other parts of the NKF had their own website. They were within the NKF website. They're part of the NKF. Why do they need a separate website? So without talking to me or anyone, Michelle contacted the website builder and created a beautiful website which still exists today. Many of you probably know it. And then she came to me and told me both, the argument that we needed our own website and, asking me to handle the politics with the NKF, which I sensed was going to be kind of a shock for them. It did suggest maybe that we weren't entirely happy with the way they were treating us. But if you want to think of it another way, the other shocking thing in that September 9th video has to do with the idea that I would serve in my role in perpetuity, that is forever. That's like an unusual concept, right? Doesn't come up very often. But that was their conclusion. And I think part of the reason they came to that conclusion is the website suggested we could easily go independent. We didn't necessarily need them. And they liked what we were doing. They thought it was worth what they were paying us, the $400,000 a year. The only problem was they raised funds going door to door in the United States. And they weren't telling the people opening those doors, we send $400,000 of this money to Canada. Yeah, they never said that. So I knew that, eventually this was going to have to stop. They could not continue. So in 2007, they had a very clear message. NKF Cybernephrology was forever. It was never stopping. They liked everything that we were doing. They wanted us to continue it. They could not fund it, but they were confident we could find some other way to do it, which was, of course, true. So the students then, they rose in prominence in my world a great deal at that moment. So you had all these highly paid professionals who no longer had jobs, but they had created a 10-year template for what they were doing. So it was clear exactly what needed to be done. And students took over the same roles, got paid hardly anything, but the experience was fantastic. So in 2007, we had a 19-year-old running a $250,000 medical meeting. Yeah. And I wouldn't say it was perfect, but it was okay, you know? Yeah. So that was interesting. So this creation of a website, I point out, is another bold move by a woman that turned out very well. Finally, a word about consensus generation. I've told you about Sam Kainer's book, and you know, I think that a lot of what's in Kainer's book is sort of common sense. So I don't think the new things we were doing got to be in the next edition of Kainer's book because he had any interest in us, but they were just kind of the logical things to do, you know. How do you lead expert-led consensus? You know, when you have a stake in the game, but it's not life or death. You know, nobody's going to die. You know, it's in a realm where you can have a stake in the game and still hold back and not speak as much in favor of your own ideas if you sense that the group is going with somebody else's. And so you have to be not macho. You have to kind of hold back and not be always pushing your own way of thinking and your own ideas. Finally, a word about how we cannot go home again. Alex Lupi has pointed out that we cannot start the Banff classification of xenograft pathology the same way that we started the main classification. Think of what we used to do. Like, somebody brought us a proposal and it wasn't quite perfect. We'd send them back to work on it for another 2 years, right? That's a fairly inefficient way to do things. But that's how early Banff ran. You know, the meetings were every 2 years, so we tried to get things done for those times. And we spent enormous amounts of time doing things that seemed important then, probably were, but now seem like nothing. I was an advocate for use of the internet, you know, and a lot of people were opposed to that and so on. Now you'd say, well, but didn't people know that resistance to the internet is futile? No, they didn't know that. So a lot of the things that we spent enormous amount of time on seem trivial now. One other one, which was a huge partial failure, the 1997 meeting that in many other ways was very successful, was differentiating PTLD from rejection. I had the bright or not so bright idea of getting lymphoma experts there to help us with that. They were so upset. They said, if we had known that the reason you asked us to come is to tell the difference between rejection and PTLD, we never would have come. That's a stupid question. We never spend a single moment thinking about that question. We have no interest in helping you with that question. You're on your own. You know? So anyway, the part of 1997 that didn't work terribly well. Yeah, and it seems trivial now because, clinicians' use of immunosuppression had gotten so much better that the incidence of PTLD started to go way down anyway, But yeah, that was one of our big problems at that time. So anyway, that's the end of what I wanted to tell you, and I would be happy to entertain questions. Yeah.
I think we're going to go on to the next one. Any questions after the question?
Okay. Yep.
Okay, it's a real pleasure to be here.